Fourth and fifth day of the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz. Author unknown. Translated by E. Foxcroft. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirk Ziegler. I still lay in my bed, and leisurely surveyed all the noble images and figures up and down about my chamber, during which, on a sudden, I heard the music of cornets, as if they had been already in procession. My page skipped out of the bed as if he had been at his wit's end, and looked more like one dead than one living. In what case I then was, is easily imaginable, for, said he, the rest are already presented to the king. I knew not what else to do, but weep outright, and curse my own slothfulness. Yet I dressed myself, but my page was ready long before me, and ran out of the chamber to see how affairs might yet stand. But he soon returned, and brought with him this joyful news, that the time indeed was not yet, but only I had overslept my breakfast, they being unwilling to waken me because of my age, but that now it was time for me to go with him to the fountain, where the most part were assembled. With this consolation my spirit returned again, wherefore I was soon ready with my habit, and went after the page to the fountain in the aforementioned garden, where I found that the lion, instead of his sword, had a pretty large tablet by him. Now, having well viewed it, I found that it was taken out of the ancient monuments, and placed here for some special honour. The inscription was somewhat worn out with age, and therefore I am minded to set it down here, as it is, and give every one leave to consider it. Prince Hermes, after so many injuries caused to the human race, a wholesome medicine is being made by the counsel of God and the assistance of art. Here I flow. He who can, drinks from me. Who desires, washes. Who dares, disturbs. Drink, brothers, and live. This writing might be well read and understood, and may therefore fitly be here placed, because easier than any of the rest. Now after we had first washed ourselves out of the fountain, and every man had taken a draught out of an entirely golden cup, we were once more again to follow the Virgin into the hall, and there put on new apparel, which was all of cloth of gold, glorious set out with flowers. There was also given to every one another golden fleece, which was set about with precious stones, and various workmanship according to the utmost skill of each artificer. On it hung a mighty medal of gold, whereon were figured the sun and moon in opposition. But on the other side stood this poesy: the light of the moon shall be as the light of the sun, and the light of the sun shall be 7 times lighter than at present. But our former jewels were laid in a little casket, and committed to one of the waiters. After this the Virgin led us out in our order, where the Moustians awaited ready at the door, all apparelled in red velvet with white guards. After which a door, which I never saw open before, to the royal winding stairs was unlocked. There the Virgin led us, together with the music, up 360 flue stairs. There we saw nothing but what was of extreme costly and artificial workmanship, and still the further we went, the more glorious still was the furniture, until at length at the top we came under a painted arch, where the 60 virgins attended us, all richly apparelled. Now, as soon as they had bowed to us, and we as well as we could had returned our reverence, our musicians were dispatched away, who feigned to go down the winding stairs again, the door being shut after them. After this a little bell was tolled, and then came in a beautiful virgin, who brought every one a wreath of laurel. But our virgins had branches given them. Meanwhile a curtain was drawn up, where I saw the king and queen as they sat there in their majesty, and had not the yesterday queen so faithfully warned me, I should have forgotten myself, and have equalled this unspeakable glory to heaven. For besides that the room glistered of mere gold and precious stones, the queen's robes were moreover so made that I was not able to behold them. And whereas before I esteemed anything for handsome, here all things so much surpassed the rest, as the stars in heaven are elevated. In the meantime the Virgin stepped in, and so each of the virgins, taking one of us by the hand, with most profound reverence presented us to the king. Whereupon the Virgin began thus to speak: "That to your honour, royal majesties, most gracious king and queen, these lords here present have adventured hither with peril of body and life. Your majesties have reason to rejoice, especially the greatest part are qualified for the enlarging of your majesties' estates and empire, as you will find the same by most gracious and particular examination of each of them. Herewith I was desirous thus to have them in humility presented to your majesties, with most humble suit to discharge me of this my commission, and most graciously to take sufficient information from each of them concerning both my actions and omissions." Hereupon she laid down her branch upon the ground. Now it would have been very fitting for one of us to have put it in and spoken somewhat on this occasion, but seeing we were all troubled with the falling of the uvula, at length the old Atlas stepped forward and spoke on the king's behalf. "Their royal majesties do most graciously rejoice at your arrival, and will that their royal grace be assured to all and every man. And with thy administration, gentle virgin, they are most graciously satisfied, and accordingly a royal reward shall therefore be provided for thee. Yet it is still their intention that thou shalt this day also continue with them, inasmuch as they have no reason to mistrust thee." Hereupon the Virgin humbly took up the branch again, and so we for this first time were to step aside with our Virgin. This room was square on the front, 5 times broader than it was long, but towards the west it had a great arch like a porch, wherein stood a circle 3 glorious royal thrones. Yet the middlemost was somewhat higher than the rest. Now in each throne sat 2 persons. In the first sat a very ancient king with a grey beard, yet his consort was extraordinary fair and young. In the third throne sat a black king of middle age, and by him a dainty old matron, not crowned, but covered with a veil. In the middle sat 2 young persons, who they had likewise wreaths of laurel upon their heads, yet over them hung a large and costly crown. Now albeit they were not at this time so fair as I before imagined to myself, yet so it was to be. Behind them on a round form sat for the most part ancient men, yet none of them, at which I wondered, had any sword or other weapon about him. Neither saw I any other life guard but certain virgins which were with us the day before, who sat on the sides of the arch. Here I cannot pass in silence how the little Cupid flew to and again there. But for the most part he hovered and played the wanton about the great crown. Sometimes he seated himself between the 2 lovers, somewhat smiling upon them with his bow. Nay, sometimes he made as if he would shoot one of us. In brief, this knave was so full of his waggery that he could not spare even the little birds in which multitudes flew up and down the room, but tormented them all he could. The virgins also had their pastimes with him, but whensoever they could catch him, it was not so easy a matter for him to get from them again. Thus this little knave made all the sport and mirth. Before the queen stood a small but unpressably curious altar, wherein lay a book covered with black velvet, only a little overlaid with gold. By this stood a small taper in an ivory candlestick. Now although they were very small, yet burnt continually, and stood in that manner, that had not Cupid in sport now and then puffed upon it, we could not have conceived it to be fire. By this stood a sphere or celestial globe, which of itself turned clearly about. This next a small striking watch by that little crystal pipe or siphon fountain, out of which perpetually ran a clear blood-red liquor, and last of all a skull, or death's head. In this was a white serpent, which was of such length that though she crept circle-wise about the rest of it, yet her tail remained in one of the eye-holes, until her head again entered into the other, so she never stirred from her skull, unless it happened that the Cupid twitched at her a little, for then she slipped in so suddenly that we could not choose but marvel at it. Together with this altar there were up and down the room wonderful images, which moved themselves as if they had been alive, and had so strange a contrivance that it would be impossible for me to relate it all. Likewise, as we were passing out, there began such a marvellous kind of vocal music, that I could not certainly tell whether it were performed by the virgins who yet stayed behind, or by the images themselves. Now we being for this time satisfied, went thence with our virgins, who, the Musidians being already present, led us down the winding stairs again, but the door was diligently locked and bolted. As soon as we were come again into the hall, one of the virgins began, "I wonder, sister, that you durst adventure yourself amongst so many persons." "My sister," replied our president, "I am fearful of none so much as of this man," pointing at me. This speech went to the heart of me, for I well understood that she mocked at my age, and indeed I was the oldest of them all. Yet she comforted me again with promise, and in that case I behaved myself well towards her. She would easily rid me of this burden. Meantime a collation was again brought in, and every one's virgin seated by him, who well knew how to shorten the time with handsome discourses. But what their discourses and sports were, I dare not blab out of school. But most of the questions were about the arts, whereby I could lightly gather that both young and old were conversant in the sciences. But still it ran through my thoughts how I might become young again, whereupon I was somewhat sadder. This the Virgin perceived, and therefore began, "I dare lay anything, if I lie with him to night, he shall be pleasanter in the morning." Whereupon they began to laugh, and albeit I blushed all over, yet I was fain to laugh too at my own ill luck. Now there was one there that had a mind to return my disgrace upon the Virgin. Whereupon he said, "I hope not only we, but the virgins too themselves will bear witness, in behalf of our brother, that Our Lady Present hath promised herself to be his bedfellow to night." "I should be well content with it," replied the Virgin. "If I had no reason to be afraid of these my sisters, there would be no hold with them should I cause the best and handsomest for myself against their will." My sister presently began another. "We find hereby that thy high office makes thee not proud. Wherefore, if by thy permission we might by lot part the lords here present amongst us for bedfellows, thou shouldst with our good will have such a prerogative." We let this pass for a jest, and began again to discourse together. But our Virgin could not leave tormenting us, and therefore began again. "My lords, how if we should permit fortune to decide which of us must lie together to night?" "Well," said I, "if it may be no otherwise, we cannot refuse such a proffer." Now because it was concluded to make this trial after meat, we resolved to sit no longer at table. So we arose, and each one walked up and down with his Virgin. "Nay," said the Virgin, "it shall not be so yet, but let us see how fortune will couple us." Upon which we were separated asunder. But now first arose a dispute how the business should be carried. But this was only a premeditated device, for the Virgin instantly made the proposal that we should mix ourselves together in a ring, and that she, beginning to count from herself, the seventh was to be content with the falling seventh, whether it were a virgin or a man. For our parts we were not aware of any craft, and therefore permitted it so to be. But when we thought we had very well mingled ourselves, the virgins nevertheless were so subtle, that each one knew her station beforehand. The Virgin began to reckon, the seventh next to her was again a virgin, the third seventh a virgin likewise, and this happened so long till, to our amazement, all the virgins came forth, and none of us was hit. Thus we poor pitiful wretches remained standing alone, and we were moreover forced to suffer ourselves to be jeered too, and confess we were very handsomely cozened. In short, who had ever seen us in our order might sooner have expected the sky to fall, than that it should never come to our turn. Herewith our sport was at an end, and we were fain to satisfy ourselves with the Virgin's waggery. In the interim, the little wanton Cupid came also into us, but because he presented himself on behalf of their royal majesties, and delivered us a health, as from them, out of a golden cup, and was to call our virgins to the king, withal declaring that he could at this time tarry no longer with them, we could not sufficiently sport ourselves with him. So with a due return of most of our humble thanks we let him fly forth again. Now because, in the interim, the mirth began to fall into my consort's feet, and the virgins were nothing sorry to see it. They quickly let up a civil dance, whom I rather beheld with pleasure than assisted, for my mercurialists were so ready with their postures, as if they had been long of the trade. After a few dances our president came in again, and told us how the artists and students had offered themselves to their royal majesties, for their honour and pleasure, before their departure to act a merry comedy, and if we thought good to be present at it, and to wait upon their royal majesties to the house of the sun, it would be acceptable to them, and they would most graciously acknowledge it. Hereupon, in the first place, we returned our most humble thanks for the honour vouchsafed us. Not only so, but moreover most submissively tendered our small service, which the Virgin related again, and presently brought word to attend the royal majesties, in our order, in the gallery, whither we were soon led, and stayed not long there, for the royal procession was just ready, yet without any music at all. The unknown queen, who was yesterday with us, went foremost with a small and costly coronet, apparelled in white satin. She carried nothing but a small crucifix, which was made of a pearl, and this very day wrought between the young king and his bride. After her went the 6 aforementioned virgins in 2 ranks, who carried the king's jewels belonging to the little altar. Next to these came the 3 kings. The bridegroom was in the midst of them in a plain dress, only in black satin, after the Italian mode. He had on a small round black hat, with a little black pointed feather, which he courteously put off to us, thereby to signify his favour towards us. To him we bowed ourselves, also to the first, as we had been before instructed. After the kings came the 3 queens, 2 of which were richly habited. Only she in the middle went likewise in all black, and Cupid held up her train. Intimation was given us to follow, and after us the virgins, till at last old Atlas brought up the rear. In such procession, though many stately walks, we at length came to the house of the sun. There, next to the king and queen, upon a richly furnished scaffold, to behold the foreordained comedy. We indeed, though separated, stood on the right hand of the kings, but the virgins on the left, except those to whom the royal ensigns were committed. To them was allotted a peculiar standing at top of all, but the rest of the attendants were fain to stand below between the columns, and therewith to be content. Now, because there are many remarkable passages in this comedy, I will not omit them in brief to run it over. First of all came forth a very ancient king, with some servants, before whose throne was brought a little chest, with mention that it was found upon the water. Now, it being opened, there appeared in it a lovely babe, together with certain jewels, and a small letter of parchment sealed and superscribed to the king, which the king therefore presently opened, and having read it, wept, and then declared to his servants how injuriously the king of the Moors had deprived his aunt of her country, and had extinguished all the royal seed even to this infant, with the daughter of which country he had now purposed to have matched his son. Whereupon he swore to maintain perpetual enmity with the Moor and his allies, and to revenge this upon him, and therewith commanded that the child should be tenderly nursed, and to make preparation against the Moor. Now this provision, and the disciple of the young lady, who, after she was a little grown up, was committed to an ancient tutor, continued all the first act, with many very fine and laudable sports besides. In the interlude a lion and griffin were set at one another to fight, and the lion got the victory, which was also a pretty sight. In the second act, the Moor, a very black treacherous fellow, came forth also, who having with vexation understood that his murder was discovered, and that too a little lady was craftily stolen from him, began thereupon to consult how by stratagem he might be able to encounter so powerful an adversary, whereof he was at length advised by certain fugitives, who by reason of famine fled to him. So the young lady, contrary to all men's expectations, fell again into his hands, whom he had not been wonderfully deceived by his own servants. He had like to have caused to be slain. Thus this act too was concluded with a marvellous triumph of the Moor. In the third act, a great army on the king's party was raised against the Moor, and put under the conduct of an ancient valiant knight, who fell into the Moor's country, till at length he forcibly rescued the young lady out of the tower, and apparelled her anew. After this, in a trice, they erected a glorious scaffold, and placed their young lady upon it. Presently came 12 royal ambassadors, amongst whom the aforementioned knight made a speech, alleging that the king, his most gracious lord, had not only heretofore delivered her from death, and even hereto caused her to be royally brought up, though she had not behaved herself altogether as became her, but moreover his royal majesty had, before others, elected her to be a spouse for the young lord, his son, and most graciously desired that the said espousals might be really executed in case they would be sworn to his majesty upon the following articles. Hereupon, out of a patent, he caused certain glorious conditions to be read, which, if it were not too long, were well worth to be here recounted. In brief, the young lady took an oath inviolably to observe the same, returning thanks withal in most seemly sort for this so high a grace. Whereupon they began to sing the praise of God, of the king, and the young lady, and so for this time departed. For sport, in the meanwhile, the 4 beasts of Daniel, as he saw them in the vision, and hath at large described them, were brought in, all of which had its certain signification. In the fourth act the young lady was again restored to her lost kingdom, and crowned, and for a space, in this array, conducted about the place with extraordinary joy. After this many and various ambassadors presented themselves, not only to wish her prosperity, but also to behold her glory. Yet it was not long that she preserved her integrity, but soon began to look wantonly about her, and to wink at the ambassadors and lords, wherein she truly acted her part to life. These her manners were soon known to the Moor, who would by no means neglect such an opportunity. Because her steward had not sufficient regard to her, she was easily blinded with great promises, so that she had no confidence in her king, but privily submitted herself to the entire disposal of the Moor. Hereupon the Moor made haste, and having, by her consent, gotten her into his hands, he gave her good word so long till all her kingdom had subjected itself to him. After which, in the third scene of this act, he caused her to be led forth, and first to be stripped stark naked, and then upon a scurvy wooden scaffold to be bound to a post, and well scourged, and at last sentenced to death. This was a woeful spectacle. It made the eyes of many to run over. Hereupon, thus naked as she was cast into prison, there to expect her death, which was to be procured by poison, which yet killed her not, but made her leprous all over. Thus this act for the most part was lamentable. Between, they brought forth Nebuchadnezzar's image, which was adorned with all manner of arms, on the head, breast, belly, legs and feet, and the like, of which two more shall be spoken of in future explication. In the fifth act, the young king was acquainted with all that had passed between the Moor and his future spouse, who first interceded with his father for her, entreating that she might not be left in that condition, which his father having agreed to, the ambassadors were dispatched to comfort her in her sickness and captivity, but yet withal to give her notice of her inconsiderateness. But she would not yet receive them, but consented to be the Moor's concubine, which was done, and the young king was acquainted with it. After this comes a band of fools, each of which brought with him a cudgel, where within a trice they made a great globe of the world, and soon undid it again. It was fine sportive fantasy. In the sixth act, the young king resolved to bid battle to the Moor, which was also done, and albeit the Moor was discomfited, yet all held the young king too for dead. At length he came to himself again, released his spouse, and committed her to his steward and chaplain, the first whereof tormented her mightily. And at last the leaf turned over, and the priest was so insolently wicked that he would needs be above all, until the same was reported to the young king, who hastily dispatched one who broke the neck of the priest's mightiness, and adorned the bride in some measure for the nuptials. After the act, a vast artificial elephant was brought forth. He carried a great tower with musicians, which was also well pleasing to all. In the last act, the bridegroom appeared in such pomp as is not well to be believed, and I was amazed how it was brought to pass. The bride met him in the like solemnity, whereupon all the people cried out, "The bridegroom lives! The bride lives!" So that by this comedy they did withal congratulate our king and queen in the most stately manner, which, as I well observed, pleased them most extraordinary well. At length they made some passes about the stage in such procession, till at last they all together thus began to sing: "This time, full of love, does our joy much improve, because of the king's nuptial, and therefore let's sing, that from all parts it ring. Blessed be he that granted us all, the bride most exquisitely fair, whom we attended with long care. To him in troth now plighted, we fully have at length obtained the same for which we did contend. He's happy that's foresighted. Now the parents kind and good by entreaties are subdued. Long enough in hold she was mewed. In honour increase till thousands arise, and spring from your own proper blood." After this thanks were returned, and the comedy was finished with joy, and the particular good liking of the royal persons, wherefore, the evening also being already hard by, they departed together in the aforementioned order. But we were to attend the royal persons up the winding stairs into the aforementioned hall, where the tables were already richly furnished, and this was the first time that we were invited to the king's table. The little altar was placed in the midst of the hall, and the 6 forenamed royal ensigns were laid on it. At this time the young king behaved himself very graciously towards us, but yet he could not be heartily merry. But howbeit he now and then discoursed a little with us, yet he often sighed, at which the little Cupid only mocked, and played his waggish tricks. The old king and queen were very serious, only the wife of one of the ancient kings was gay enough, the cause whereof I yet understood not. During this, the royal persons took up the first table. At the second we only sat. At the third, some of the principal virgins placed themselves. The rest of the virgins and men were all fain to wait. This was performed with such state and solemn stillness that I am afraid to make any words of it. Here I cannot leave untouched how all of the royal persons, before meat, attired themselves in snow white glittering garments, and so sat down to the table. Over the table hang the forementioned great golden crown, the precious stones whereof, without any other light, would have sufficiently illuminated the hall. However, all the lights were kindled at the small taper upon the altar. What the reason was I did not certainly know, but this I took very good notice of, that the young king frequently sent meat to the white serpent upon the little altar, which caused me to muse. Almost all the prattle at this banquet was made by little Cupid, who could not leave us, and me indeed especially, untormented. He was perpetually producing some strange matter. However, there was no considerable mirth, all were silently on, from whence I, by myself, could imagine some great imminent peril, for there was no music at all heard. But if we were demanded anything, we were fain to give short round answers, and so let it rest. In short order, all things had so strange a face, that the sweat began to trickle down all over my body, and I am apt to believe that the stout heartiest man alive would then have lost his courage. Supper now being almost ended, the young king commanded the book to be reached him from the altar. This he opened, and caused it once again by an old man to be propounded to us, whether we resolved to abide with him in prosperity and adversity, which we having with trembling consented to, he further caused us sadly to be demanded, whether we would give him our hands on it, which, when we could find no evasion, was fain so to be. Hereupon one after another arose, and with his own hand writ himself down in this book. When this also was performed, the little crystal fountain, together with a very small crystal glass, was brought near, out of which all the royal persons one after another drank. Afterwards it reached to us too, and so forward to all persons, and this was called the draught of silence. Hereupon all the royal persons presented us their hands, declaring that in case we did not stick to them, we should now and never more hereafter see them, which verily made our eyes run over. But our president engaged herself and promised very largely on our behalf, which gave them satisfaction. Meantime a little bell was tolled, at which all the royal persons waxed so mighty bleak, that we were ready utterly to despair. They quickly put off their white garments again, and put on entirely black ones. The whole hall likewise was hung about with black velvet, the floor was covered with black velvet, with which also the ceiling above, all this being before prepared, was overspread. After that the tables were also removed away, and all had seated themselves round about upon the form, and we had also put on black habits. In comes our president again, who was before gone out, and brought with her 6 black taffeta scarfs, with which she bound the 6 royal persons' eyes. Now, when they could no longer see, there were immediately brought in by the servants 6 covered coffins, and set down in the hall, also a low black seat placed in the midst. Finally, there steps in a very coal-black tall man, who bare in his hand a sharp axe. Now after that the old king had been first brought to the seat, his head was instantly whipped off, and wrapped up in a black cloth, but the blood was received into the great golden goblet, and placed with him in this coffin that stood by, which being covered was set aside. Thus it went with the rest also, so that I thought it would have length come to me too, but it did not. For as soon as the 6th royal persons were beheaded, the black man went out again, after whom another followed, who beheaded him too just before the door, and brought back his head together with the axe, which were laid in a little chest. This indeed to me seemed a bloody wedding, but because I could not tell what would yet be the event, I was fain for that time to captivate my understanding until I were further resolved. For the Virgin too, seeing that some of us were faint-hearted and wept, bid us to be content. For, said she to us, The life of these standeth now in your hands, and in case you follow me, this death shall make many alive." Herewith she intimated we should go sleep, and trouble ourselves no further on our part, for they should be sure to have their due right. And so she bade us all good night, saying that she must watch the dead corpse this night. We did so, and were each of us conducted by our pages into our lodgings. My page talked with me about the sundry and various matters, which I still very well remember, and gave me cause enough to admire at his understanding, but his intention was to lull me asleep, which at last I well observed, whereupon I made as though I was fast asleep, but no sleep came into my eyes, and I could not put the beheaded out of my mind. Now my lodging was directly over against the great lake, so that I could look well upon it, the windows being nigh the bed. About midnight, as soon as the clock had struck 12, on a sudden I espied on the lake a great fire, wherefore out of fear I quickly opened the window to see what would become of it. Then from far I saw 7 ships making forward, which were all stuck full of lights. Above, upon the top of each of them, hovered a flame, that passed to and fro, and sometimes descended quite down, so that I could lightly judge that it must needs be the spirits of the beheaded. Now these ships gently approached to land, and each of them had no more than 1 mariner. As soon as they were gotten to shore, I presently espied our Virgin with a torch going towards the ships, after whom the 6 covered coffins together with the little chest were carried, and each of them privily laid in a ship. Wherefore I awakened my page too, who hugely thanked me, for having run much up and down all the day, he might quite have overslept this, though he well knew it. Now as soon as the coffins were laid in the ships, all the lights were extinguished, and the 6 flames passed back together over the lake, so that there was no more but 1 light in each ship for a watch. There were also some hundreds of watchmen, who had encamped themselves on the shore, and sent the Virgin back into the castle again, who carefully bolted all up again, so that I could well judge that there was nothing more to be done this night, but that we must expect the day. So we again betook ourselves to rest, and I only of all my company had a chamber towards the lake, and saw this, so that now I was so extreme weary, and so fell asleep in my manifold speculations. The 5th day. The night was over, and the dear wished for day broken, when hastily I got out of the bed, more desirous to learn what might yet ensue, than that I had sufficiently slept. Now after that I put on my clothes, and according to my custom was gone downstairs. It was still too early, and I found nobody else in the hall, wherefore I entreated my page to lead me a little about the castle, and show me somewhat that was rare, who was now, as always, willing, and presently led me down certain steps underground to a great iron door, on which the following words in great copper letters were fixed: "Here lies buried Venus, that beauty which hath undone many a great man, both in fortune, honour, blessing, and prosperity." This I thus copied and set down in my table book. Now, after this door was opened, the page led me by the hand through a very dark passage, till we came again to a very little door, that was now only put to, for, as the page informed me, it was first opened but yesterday when the coffins were taken out, and had not been since shut. Now, as soon as we stepped in, I espied the most precious thing that nature ever created, for this vault had no other light but from certain huge great carbuncles, and this, as I was informed, was the king's treasury. But the most glorious and principal thing that I saw here was a sepulchre which stood in the middle, so rich that I wondered it was no better guarded. Whereunto the page answered me, that I had a good reason to be thankful to my planet, by whose influence it was that I now had seen certain pieces which no human eye else, except the king's family, had ever had a view of. This sepulchre was triangular, and had in the middle of it a kettle of polished copper. The rest was of pure gold and precious stones. In the kettle stood an angel, who held in his arms an unknown tree, from which continually dropped fruit into the kettle, and was oft as the fruit fell into the kettle it turned into water too, and ran out from thence into 3 small golden kettles standing by. This little altar was supported by these 3 animals, an eagle, an ox, and a lion, which stood on an exceedingly costly base. I asked my page what this might signify. "Here," said he, "lies buried Lady Venus, that beauty which hath undone many a great man, both in fortune, honour, blessing, and prosperity. After which he showed me a copper door on the pavement. Here, said he, if you please, we may go further down. I still follow you, replied I, so I went down the steps, where it was exceeding dark, but the page immediately opened a little chest, wherein stood a small ever-burning taper, at which he kindled one of the many torches which lay by. I was mightily terrified, and seriously asked how he durst do this. He gave me for answer, as long as the royal persons are still at rest, I have nothing to fear. Herewith I espied a rich bed, ready made, hung about with curious curtains, one of which he drew, where I saw the Lady Venus stark naked, for he heaved up the coverlets too, lying there in such beauty, and a fashion so surprising that I was almost beside myself. Neither do I yet know whether it was a piece thus carved, or a human corpse that lay dead there, for she was altogether immovable, and yet I durst not touch her, for she was again covered, and the curtain drawn before her, yet she was still, as it were, in my eye. But I soon espied behind the bed a tablet, on which was thus written: "When the fruit of my tree shall be quite melted down, then I shall awake and be the mother of a king." I asked my page concerning this writing, but he laughed, with a promise that I should know it too. So he, putting out the torch, we again ascended. Then I better viewed all the little doors, and first found that on every corner there burned a small taper of pyrites, of which I had before taken no notice, for the fire was so clear that it looked much liker a stone than a taper. From this heat the tree was forced to continually melt, yet it still produced new fruit. "Now behold," said the page, "what I heard revealed to the king by Atlas. When the tree," said he, "shall be quite melted down, then Lady Venus awake, and be the mother of a king." Whilst he was thus speaking, in flew the little Cupid, who at first was somewhat abashed at our presence, but seeing us both look more like dead than living, he could not at length refrain from laughing, demanded what spirit had brought me hither, whom I with trembling answered, that I had lost my way in the castle, and was by chance come hither, and that the page likewise had been looking up and down for me, and at last lighted upon me here. I hoped he would not take it amiss. "Nay, then 'tis well enough," said Cupid. "My old busy grandsire, but you might lightly have served me a scurvy trick, had you been aware of this door. Now I must look better to it." And so he put a strong lock on the copper door, where we before descended. I thank God that he lit it upon us no sooner. My page too was more jocund, because I had so well helped him at his pitch. "Yet I cannot," said Cupid, "let it pass unrevenged, that you were so near stumbling upon my dear mother." With that he put the point of his dart into one of the little tapers, and heating it a little, pricked me with it on the hand, which at that time I little regarded, but was glad that it went so well with us, and that we came off without further danger. Meantime my companions were gotten out of bed too, and were again returned into the hall, to whom I also joined myself, making as if I were then first risen. After Cupid had carefully made all fast again, he came likewise to us, and would needs have me show him my hand, where he still found a little drop of blood, at which he heartily laughed, and bade the rest have care of me. I would shortly end my days. We all wondered how Cupid could be so merry, and have no sense at all of the yesterday's sad passages, but he was no what troubled. Now our president had in the meantime made herself ready for the journey, coming in all in black velvet, yet she still bare her branch of laurel. Her virgins too had their branches. Now all things being in readiness, the Virgin bid us first drink somewhat, and then presently prepare for the procession. Wherefore we made no long tarrying, but followed her out of the hall into the court. In the court stood 6 coffins, and my companions thought no other but that the 6 royal persons lay in them. But I well observed the device. I knew not what was to be done with these other. By each coffin were 8 muffled men. Now as soon as the music went, it was so mournful, dolesome a tune, that I was astonished at it. They took up the coffins, and we, as we were ordered, were fain to go after them into the forementioned garden, in the midst of which was erected a wooden edifice, having round about the roof a glorious crown, and standing upon 7 columns. Within it were formed 6 sepulchres, and by each of them a stone, but in the middle it had a round hollow rising stone. In these graves the coffins were quietly and with many ceremonies laid. The stones were shoved over them, and they shut fast. But the little chest was to lie in the middle. Herewith were my companions deceived, for they imagined no other but that the dead corpse were there. Upon the top of all there was a great flag, having a phoenix painted on it, perhaps therewith the more to delude us. Here I had great occasion to thank God that I had seen more than the rest. Now after the funerals were done, the Virgin, having placed herself upon the middlemost stone, made a short oration, that we should be constant to our engagements, and not repine at the pains we were hereafter to undergo, but to be helpful in restoring the present buried royal persons to life again, and therefore without delay to rise up with her, to make the journey to the tower of Olympus, to fetch from thence medicines useful and necessary for this purpose. This we soon agreed to, and followed her through another little door quite to the shore. There the 7 forementioned ships stood all empty, on which the Virgin stuck up their laurel branches, and after they had distributed us in the 6 ships, they caused us in God's name thus to begin our voyage, and looked upon us as long as they could have us in sight, after which they with all the watchmen returned to the castle. Our ships had each of them a peculiar device. 5 of them indeed had 5 regular bodies, each a several one, but mine, in which the Virgin too sat, carried a globe. Thus we sailed on in singular order, and each had only 2 mariners. Foremost went the ship A, in which, as I conceive, the Moor lay. In this were 12 musicians, who played excellent well. Its device was a pyramid. Next followed 3 abreast, B, C, and D, in which we were disposed. I sat in C. In the midst behind these came the 2 fairest and stateliest ships, E and F, stuck about with many branches of laurel, having no passengers in them. Their flags were the sun and the moon. But in the rear only one ship, G. In this were 40 virgins. Now being thus passed over this lake, we first came through a narrow arm into the right sea, where all the sirens, nymphs, and sea goddesses had attended us. Wherefore they immediately dispatched a sea nymph to deliver us their present and offering of honour to the wedding. It was a costly great set round and orient pearl, the like of which hath not at any time been seen, either in ours or yet in the New World. Now the Virgin having friendly received it, the nymph further entreated that audience might be given to their divertissements, and to make a little stand, which the Virgin was content to do, and commanded the 2 great ships to stand into the middle, and with the rest to encompass them in a pentagon. After which the nymphs fell into a ring about them, and with a most delicate sweet voice began thus to sing: There is nothing better here below Than beauteous noble love, whereby we like to God do grow, and none to grief do move. Wherefore let's chant it to the King, that all the sea thereof may ring. We question, answer you, what was it at first us made? It was love. And what hath grace afresh conveyed? It is love. Whence wasn't, pray tell us, we were born? Of love. How came we then again forlorn? Sans love. Who was it that us conceived? It was love. Who suckled, nursed, and relieved? It was love. What is it we to our parents owe? It is love. What do they us such kindness show? Of love. Who gathers in the victory? It is love. Can love by search obtained be? By love. How many a man good works perform? Through love. Who into can 2 transform? It is love. Then let our song sound, until its echoes rebound, to love's honour and praise, which may ever increase, with our noble princes, the King and the Queen. The soul is departed, their bodies are within, and as long as we live God graciously give, that as great love and amity they bear each other mightily, so likewise by love's own flame may reconjoin them once again. Then this annoy into great joy shall change and ever so remain. They having the most admirable consent and melody finished this song, I no more wondered at Ulysses for stopping the lyres of his companions, for I seemed to myself the most unhappy man alive, that nature had not made me to so trim a creature. But the Virgin soon dispatched them, and commanded to set sail from thence. Wherefore the nymphs too, after they had been presented with a long red scarf for a gratuity, went off, and dispersed themselves in the sea. It was at this time sensible that Cupid began to work with me too, which yet tended but very little to my credit, and forasmuch as my giddiness is likely to be nothing beneficial to the reader, I am resolved to let it rest as it is. But this was the very wound that in the first book I received on the head in a dream, and let every one take warning by me of loitering about Venus's bed, for Cupid can by no means brook it. After some hours, having in friendly discourses made a good way, we came within ken of the tower of Olympus. Wherefore the Virgin commanded by the discharge of some pieces to give the signal of our approach, which was also done. And immediately we espied a great white flag thrust out, and a small gilded penance sent forth to meet us. As soon as this was come to us, we perceived it in a very ancient man, the warden of the tower, with certain guards clothed in white, of whom we were friendly received, and so conducted to the tower. This tower was situated upon an island exactly square, which was environed with a wall so firm and thick that I myself counted 260 passes over. On the other side of the wall was a fine meadow with certain little gardens, in which grew strange and unknown to me fruits, and then again an inner wall about the tower. The tower of itself was just as if it had 7 round towers had been built one by another, yet the middlemost was somewhat the higher, and within they all entered into one another, and had 7 stories one above the other. Being thus come to the gates of the tower, we were led a little aside on the wall, that is so, as I well observed, the coffins might be brought into the tower without our taking notice. Of this the rest knew nothing. This being done, we were conducted into the tower at the very bottom, which albeit it were excellently painted, yet we had here little recreation, for this was nothing but a laboratory, where we were fain to beat and wash plants, and precious stones, and all sorts of things, and extract their juice and essence, and put up the same in glasses, and deliver them to be laid up. And truly our Virgin was so busy with us, and so full of her directions, that she knew how to give each of us employment enough, so that in this island we were fain to be mere drudges, till we had achieved all that was necessary for the restoring of the beheaded bodies. Meantime, as I afterwards understood, 3 virgins were in the first apartment washing the corpse with all diligence. Now having at length almost done with this our preparation, nothing more was brought to us, but some broth with a little draught of wine, whereby I well observed that we were not here for our pleasure, for when we had finished our day's work too, every one had only a mattress laid on the ground for him, wherewith we were content to ourselves. For my part, I was not very much troubled with sleep, and therefore walked out into the garden, and at length came as far as the wall, and because the heaven was at that time very clear, I could well drive away the time in contemplating the stars. By chance I came to a great pair of stone stairs, which led up to the top of the wall, and because the moon shone very bright, I was so much the more confident, and went up, and looked too a little upon the sea, which was now exceedingly calm, and thus having good opportunity to consider better of astronomy, I found that this present night there would happen such a conjunction of the planets, the like to which was not otherwise suddenly to be observed. Now having looked a good little into the sea, and it being just about midnight, as soon as it had struck 12, I beheld far from the 7 flames passing over the sea hitherward, and betaking themselves to the top of the spire of the tower. This made me somewhat afraid, for as soon as the flames had settled themselves, the winds arose, and began to make the sea very tempestuous. The moon also was covered with clouds, and my joy ended with such fear, that I had scarce time enough to hit upon the stairs again, and betake myself again to the tower. Now whether the flames tarried any longer, or passed away again, I cannot say, for in this obscurity I durst no more venture abroad. So I laid me down on my mattress, and there being besides in the laboratory a pleasant and gentle purling fountain, I fell asleep so much the sooner. And thus this 5th day too was concluded with wonders. End of the 4th and 5th day. Recording by Kirk Ziegler, Ogden, Utah. Voiceovers by Kirk.com. Seventh day of the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. Author unknown. Translated by E. Foxcroft. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirk Ziegler. The next morning, after we had awakened one another, we sat together a while to discourse what might yet be the event of things. For some were of opinion that they should all be livened again together. Others contradicted it, because the decrease of the ancients was not only to restore life, but to increase to the young ones. Some imagined that they were not put to death, but that others were beheaded in their stead. We having now talked together a pretty long while, in comes the old man to us, and first saluting us, looks about him to see if all things were ready, and in the process enough done. We had herein so behaved ourselves, that he had no fault to find with our diligence, whereupon he placed all the glasses together, and put them into a case. Presently come certain youths, bringing with them some ladders, ropes, and large wings, which they laid down before us, and departed. The old man began thus: "My dear sons, one of these three things must each of you this day constantly bear about with him. Now it is free for you either to make a choice of one of them, or to cast lots about it." We replied, we would choose. "Nay," said he, "let it rather go by lot." Hereupon he made three little schedules. In one he writ ladder, on the second rope, on the third wings. These he laid in a hat, and each man must draw, and whatever he happened upon, that was to be his. Those who got the ropes imagined themselves to be in the best case, but I chanced on the ladder, which hugely affected me, for it was 12 foot long and pretty weighty, and I must be forced to carry it, whereas the others could handsomely coil their ropes about them. As for the wings, the old man joined them so nearly on the third sort, as if they had grown upon them. Hereupon he turned the cock, and then the fountain ran no longer, and we were fain to remove it from the middle out of the way. After all things were carried off, he taking with him the casket and the glasses took leave, and locked the door fast after him, so that we imagined no other but that we had been imprisoned in this tower. But it was hardly a quarter of an hour before a round hole at the very top was uncovered, where we saw our Virgin, who called to us, and bade us good morrow, desiring us to come up. They with the wings were instantly above the hole, only they with the ropes were in evil plight. For as soon as ever one of us was up, he was commanded to draw up the ladder to him. At last each man's rope was hanged on an iron hook, so every one was fain to climb up by his rope as well as he could, which indeed was not compassed without blisters. Now as soon as we were all well up, the hole was covered again, and we were friendly received by the Virgin. The room was the whole breadth of the tower itself, having 6 very stately vestries, a little raised above the room, and to be entered by the ascent of 3 stairs. In these vestries we were distributed, there to pray for the life of the king and queen. Meanwhile the Virgin went in and out at the little door, till we had done. For as soon as our process was absolved, there was brought in, and placed in the middle through the little door, by 12 persons, which formerly were our musicians, a wonderful thing of longish shape, which my companions took only to be a fountain. But I well observed that the corpse lay in it, for the inner chest was of an oval figure, so large that 6 persons might well lie in it one by another. After which they again went forth, fetched their instruments, and conducted our Virgin, together with her she attendants, and a almost delicate noise of music. The Virgin carried a little casket, but the rest only branches and small lamps, and some 2 lighted torches. The torches were immediately given into our hands, and we were to stand about the fountain in this order. First stood Virgin A with her attendants in a ring about the lamps and branches. C. Next stood we with our torches. B. Then the musicians in a long rank. Last of all the rest of Virgins D. in another long rank too. Now whence the virgins came, or whether they dwelled in the castle, or whether they were brought in by night, I know not, for all their faces were covered with delicate white linen, so that I could not know any of them. Hereupon the Virgin opened the casket, in which there was a round thing wrapped up in a piece of green double taffeta. She laid in the uppermost kettle, and then covered it with the lid. which was full of holes, and had besides a rim, on which she poured in some water, which we had the day before prepared, whence the fountain began immediately to run, and through 4 small pipes to drive into the little kettle. Beneath the undermost kettle there were many sharp points, on which the virgins stuck their lamps, that so the heat might come to the kettle, and make the water seethe. Now the water beginning to simper, by many little holes it fell upon the bodies, and was so hot that it dissolved them all, and then turned them into liquor. But what the above said round wrapped up a thing was, my companions knew not, but I understood that it was the Moor's head, from which the water conceived so great a heat. At B, around about the great kettle, there were again many holes, in which they stuck their branches. Now whether this was done of necessity, or only for ceremony, I know not. However, these branches were continually besprinkled by the fountain, whence it afterwards dropped somewhat of a deeper yellow into the kettle. This lasted for near 2 hours. That the fountain was still constantly ran of itself, but yet the longer, the fainter it was. In the meantime the musicians went their way, and we walked up and down the room, and truly the room was so made, that we had opportunity enough to pass away our time. There was for images, paintings, clocks, organs, springing fountains, and the like, nothing forgotten. Now it was near the time that the fountain ceased, and would no longer run, upon which the Virgin commanded a round golden globe to be brought. At the bottom of the fountain there was a tap, by which she let out all the matter that was dissolved by those hot drops, whereof certain quarts were then very red, into the globe. The rest of the water which remained above in the kettle was poured out, and so this fountain, which was now become much lighter, was again carried forth. Whether it was opened abroad, or whether anything of the bodies that was further useful yet remained, I dare not certainly say. But this I know, that the water that was emptied into the globe was much heavier than 6, yet more of us were able to bear, albeit for its bulk it should have seemed not too heavy for one man. Now this globe being with so much ado gotten out of doors, we again sat alone, but I perceived a trampling overhead, had an eye to my ladder. Here one might take notice of the strange opinions of my companions had concerning this fountain, for they not imagining but that the bodies lay in the garden of the castle, knew not what to make of this kind working, but I thanked God that I had wakened in so opportune a time, and saw that which helped me the better in all the Virgin's business. After 1/4 of an hour the cover was again lifted off, and we commanded to come up, which was done as before with wings, ladders, and ropes. And it did not little vex me, that whereas the virgins could go up another way, we were fain to take so much toil. Yet I could well judge that there must be some special reason in it, and we must leave somewhat for the old man to do. For even those with wings had no advantage by them but when they were to mount through the hole. Now being gotten up thither so, and the hole shut again, I saw the globe hanging by a strong chain in the middle of the room. In this room was nothing else but mere windows, and still between 2 windows there was a door, which was covered with nothing but great polished looking glass. And these windows and looking glasses were so optically opposed to one another, that although the sun, which now shined exceedingly bright, beat only upon one door, yet, after the windows towards the sun were opened, and the doors before the looking glasses drawn aside, in all quarters of the room there was nothing but suns, which by artificial reflections beat upon the whole golden globe hanging in the midst. And as forasmuch as the same was polished, it gave such a lustre that none of us could open our eyes, but were there forced to look out at windows till the globe was well heated, and brought to the desired effect. Here I may well now avow that in these mirrors I have seen the most wonderful spectacle that ever nature brought to light, for there were suns in all places, and the globe in the middle shined yet, and Collins, although he was none of our fraternity, yet brighter, so that, but for one twinkling of an eye, we could no more endure it than the sun itself. At length the Virgin commanded to shut up the looking glasses again, and to make fast the windows, and so let the little globe cool again. And this was done about 7 of the clock, wherefore we thought good, since we might now have leisure a little to refresh ourselves with a breakfast. This treatment again was right philosophical, and we had no need to be afraid of intemperance, yet we had no want. And the hope of the future joy, with which the Virgin continually comforted us, made us so jocund that we regarded not any pains or inconvenience. And this I can truly say concerning my companions of high quality, that their minds never ran after their kitchen or table, but their pleasure was only to attend upon this adventurous psychic, and hence to contemplate the Creator's wisdom and omnipotency. After we had taken our reflection, we again settled ourselves to work, for the globe was sufficiently cooled, which with toil and labour we were to lift off the chain, and set upon the floor. Now the dispute was how to get the globe asunder, for we were commanded to divide the same in the midst. The conclusion was that a sharp pointed diamond would best do it. Now when we had thus opened the globe, there was nothing of redness more to be seen, but a lovely great snow-white egg. It was most mightily rejoiced us, and this was so well brought to pass. For the Virgin was in perpetual care, lest the shell might still be too tender. We stood round about this egg, as jocund as if we ourselves had laid it. But the Virgin made it presently be carried forth, and departed herself too from us again, and, as always, locked the door too. But what she did abroad with the egg, or whether it were some way privately handled, I know not, neither do I believe it. Yet we were again to pause together for 1/4 of an hour, till the third hole were opened, and we, by means of our instruments, were come upon the fourth stone or floor. In this room we found a great copper kettle filled with yellow sand, which was warmed with a gentle fire. Afterwards the egg was raked up in it, that it might therein come to perfect maturity. This kettle was exactly square. Upon one side stood these 2 verses, writ in great letters: "Oh, do not cease praying, my beloved. If it pleases you, pray then for gold." On the second side were these 3 words: "Health, snow, lance," meaning, healing is dependent on the lance. The third had no more but this one word, fiat, or so be it. But on the hindermost part stood an entire inscription running thus: "What fire, air, water, and earth are not able to rescue from the holy ashes of our kings and queens, the host of faithful alchemists have collected into this urn, in the year of the Lord 1459. Now whether the sand or egg were hereby meant, I leave to the learned dispute, yet do I my part, and omit nothing undeclared. Our egg being now ready was taken out, but it needed no cracking, for the bird that was in it soon freed himself, and showed himself very jocund, yet he looked very bloody and unshapen. We first set him upon the warm sand, so the Virgin commanded, that before we gave him anything to eat, we should be sure to make him fast, otherwise he would give us all work enough. This being done too, food was brought him, which surely was nothing else than the blood of the beheaded, diluted again with prepared water, by which the bird grew so fast under our eyes that we well saw why the Virgin gave us such warning of him. He bit and scratched so devilishly about him, that could he have had his own will upon any of us, he would soon have dispatched him. Now he was wholly black and wild, wherefore other meat was brought him, perhaps the blood of another of the royal persons, whereupon all his black feathers molted again, and instead of them there grew out snow-white feathers. He was somewhat tamer too, and suffered himself to be more tractable. Nevertheless, we did not yet trust him. The third feeding his feathers began to be so curiously coloured, that in all my life I never saw the like colours for beauty. He was also exceeding tame, and behaved himself so friendly with us, that the Virgin consenting, we released him from captivity. "'Tis now the season," began our Virgin, "since by your diligence, and by our old man's consent, the bird has attained both his life and the highest perfection, that he be also joyfully consecrated by us." Herewith she commanded to bring in dinner, and that we should again refresh ourselves, since the most troublesome part of our work was now over, and it was fit we should begin to enjoy our past labours. We began to make ourselves merry together. Howbeit, we still had all our mourning clothes on, which seemed somewhat reproachful to our mirth. Now the Virgin was perpetually inquisitive, perhaps to find which of us her future purpose might prove serviceable, but her discourse was for the most part about melting, and it pleased her well when one seemed expert in such compendious manuals, as do peculiarly commend an artist. This dinner lasted not above 3/4 of an hour, which we yet for the most part spent with our bird, whom we were fain constantly to feed with his meat, but still he continued much at the same growth. After dinner we were not long suffered to digest our meat, but after that the Virgin together with the bird was departed from us. The fifth room was set open to us, whither we got to after the former manner, and tendered our service. In this room a bath was prepared for our bird, which was so coloured with a fine white powder that it had the appearance of mere milk. Now it was at first cool when the bird was set into it. He was mightily pleased with it, drinking of it, and pleasantly sporting in it. But after it began to heat, by reason of the lamps that were placed under it, we had enough to do to keep him in the bath. We therefore clapped a cover over the kettle, and suffered him to thrust his head out through the hole, till he had in this sort lost all his feathers in this bath, and was as smooth as a new-born child. Yet the heat did to him no further harm, at which I much marvelled, for in this bath the feathers were quite consumed, and the bath was thereby tinged into blue. At length we gave the bird air, who of himself sprung out of the kettle, and was so glitteringly smooth that it was a pleasure to behold. But because he was still somewhat wild, we were fain to put a collar with a chain about his neck, and so led him up and down the room. Meantime a strong fire was made under the kettle, and the bath sodden away till it all came to blue stone, which we took out, and having first pounded it, we were afterwards fain to grind it on a stone, and finally with this colour to paint the bird's whole skin over. Now he looked much more strangely, for he was all blue, except the head, which remained white. Herewith our work on this story was to performed, and we, after the German with her blue bird was departed from us, were called up through the hole to the 6th story, which was done too. There we were mightily troubled, for in the midst a little altar, every way like that in the king's hall above described, was placed, upon which stood the 6 aforementioned particulars, and he himself, the bird, made the 7th. First of all the little fountain was set before him, out of which he drank a good draught. Afterwards he pecked upon the white serpent until she bled mightily. This blood we were to receive into a golden cup, and pour it down the bird's throat, who was mighty averse from it. Then we dipped the serpent's head in the fountain, upon which she again revived, and crept into her death's head, so that I saw her no more for a long time after. Meantime the sphere turned constantly on, until it made the desired conjunction. Immediately the watch struck 1, upon which there was going another conjunction. Then the watch struck 2. Finally, whilst we were observing the 3rd conjunction, and the same was indicated by the watch, the poor bird himself submissively laid down his neck upon the book, and willingly suffered his head, by one of us, thereto chosen by lot, to be smitten off. Howbeit he yielded not one drop of blood, till he was opened on the breast, and then the blood spun out so fresh and clear, as if it had been a fountain of rubies. His death went to the heart of us, and yet we might well judge that a naked bird would stand us in little stead. So we let it rest, and removed the little altar away, and insisted the Virgin to burn the body, together with the little hanging tablet by, to ashes, with fire kindled at the little taper. Afterwards to cleanse the same several times, and to lay them in a box of cypress wood. Here I cannot conceal what a trick I and 3 more were served. After we had thus diligently taken up the ashes, the Virgin began to speak thus: "My lords, we are here in the 6th room, and we have only one more before us, in which our trouble will be at an end, and then we shall return home again to our castle, to awaken our most gracious lords and ladies. Now albeit I could hardly wish that all of you, as you are here together, had behaved yourselves in such sort that I might have given you commendations to our most renowned king and queen, and you have obtained a suitable reward, yet because, contrary to my desire, I have found amongst you these 4," herewith she pointed at me and 3 more, "lazy and sluggish labourers, and yet according to my good will to all and every one, I am not willing to deliver them up to condone punishment. However, That such negligence may not remain wholly unpunished, I am proposing thus concerning them, that they shall only be excluded from the future seventh and most glorious action of all the rest, and so too they shall incur no further blame from their royal majesties." In what a case we were now at this speech, I leave others to consider; for the Virgin so well knew how to keep her countenance, that the water soon ran over the baskets, and we esteemed ourselves the most unhappy of all men. After this, the Virgin by one of her maids, whereof there were always many at hand, caused the musicians to be fetched, who were with the cornets to blow us out of doors with such scorn and derision that they themselves could hardly sound for laughing. But it did particularly mightily affect us that the Virgin so vehemently laughed at our weeping, anger, and impatience, and that there might well perhaps be some amongst our companions who were glad of this our misfortune. But it proved otherwise, for as soon as we were come out at the door, the musicians bid us of good cheer and follow them up the winding stairs. They led us up to the seventh floor under the roof, where we found the old man, whom we had not hitherto seen, standing upon a little round furnace. He received us friendly, and heartily congratulated us that we were hereto chosen by the Virgin. But after he understood the affright we had conceived, his belly was ready to burst with laughing, that we had taken such good fortune so heinously. Hence said he, "My dear sons, learn, that man never knoweth how well God intendeth him." During this discourse, the Virgin also with her little box came running in, who, after she had sufficiently laughed at us, emptied her ashes out into another vessel, and filled hers again with other matter, saying, she must now go cast a mist before the other artists' eyes, that we in the meantime should obey the old lord in whatever he commanded us, and not remit our former diligence. Herewith she departed from us into the seventh room, whither she called our companions. Now what she first did with them there I cannot tell, for they were not only the most earnestly forbidden to speak of it, but we too, by reason of our business, durst not peep on them through the ceiling. But this was our work: we were to moisten the ashes with prepared water, till they came together like a very thin dough. After which we set the matter over the fire till it was well heated. Then we cast it thus, hot as it was, into two little forms or moulds, and so let it cool a little. Here we had leisure to look upon our companions through certain crevices made in the floor. They were now very busy at a furnace, and each was himself fain to blow up the fire with a pipe, and they stood thus blowing about it, as if they were herein wondrously preferred before us. And this blowing lasted so long till our old man roused us to our work again, so that I cannot say what was done afterwards. We having opened our little forms, there appeared two beautiful, bright, and almost transparent little images, the like to which man's eye never saw, a male and a female, each of them only 4 inches long. And that which most mightily surprised me was, that they were not hard, but limber and fleshy as other human bodies, yet they had no life. So that I do most assuredly believe that the Lady Venus's image was also made after some such way. These angelically fair babes we first laid upon 2 little satin cushions, and beheld them a good while, till we were almost besotted upon so exquisite an object. The old lord warned us to forbear, and continually to instil the blood of the bird, which had been received into a golden cup, drop after drop into the mouths of the little images, from whence they apparently to the eye increased. And whereas they were before very small, they were now, according to proportion, much more beautiful. So that worthily all limners ought to have been there, and have been ashamed of their art in respect of these productions of nature. Now they grow so big that we lifted them from the little cushions, and were fain to lay them upon a long table, which was covered with white velvet. The old man also commanded us to cover them over up to the breast with a piece of fine white double taffeta, which, because of their unspeakable beauty, almost went against us. But that I may be brief, before we had this in manner quite spent the blood, they were already in their perfect full growth. They had gold yellow curled hair, and above mentioned figure of Venus was nothing to them. But there was not yet any natural warmth or sensibility in them. They were dead figures, yet of a lively and natural colour, and since it was to be taken that they grew not too great, the old man would not permit anything more to be given them, but quite covered their faces too with the silk, and caused the table to be stuck round with the torches. Here I must warn the reader that he imagine not these lights to have been of necessity, for the old man's intent hereby was only that we should not observe when the soul entered into them, as indeed we should not have taken notice of it, in case I had not twice before seen the flames. However, I permitted the three other to remain in their belief, neither did the old man know that I had seen anything more. Hereupon he bid us sit down on a bench over against the table. Presently the Virgin came in too with the music and all furniture, and carried two curious white garments, the like to which I have never seen in the castle, neither can I describe them, for I thought no other but that they were mere crystal, but they were gentle and not transparent, so that I cannot speak of them. These she laid down on a table, and after she had disposed her Virgin upon a bench round about, she and the old man began many legerdemain tricks about the table, which was done only to blind us. This, as I told you, was managed under the roof, which was wonderfully formed. For the inside it was arched into 7 hemispheres, of which the middlemost was somewhat the highest, and at the top a little round hole, which was nevertheless shut, and was observed by no one else. After these ceremonies stepped in 6 virgins, each of which bare a large trumpet, which were rowled about with green glittering and burning material like a wreath, one of which the old man took, and after he had removed some of the lights at top, and uncovered their faces, he placed one of the trumpets upon the mouth of one of the bodies in such a manner that the upper and wider part of it was directed just against the aforementioned hole. Here my companions always looked upon the images, but I had other thoughts. For as soon as the foliage or wreath about the shank of the trumpet was kindled, I saw the hole at the top open, and a bright stream of fire shooting down the tube, and passing into the body, whereupon the hole was again covered, and the trumpet removed. With this device my companions were deluded, so that they imagined that life came into the image by means of the fire of foliage, for as soon as he received the soul, he twinkled with his eyes, howbeit he scarce stirred. The second time he placed another tube upon its mouth, and kindled it again, and the soul was let down through the tube. This was repeated upon each of them 3 times, after which all of the lights were extinguished and carried away. The velvet carpets of the table were cast together over them, and immediately a travelling bed was unlocked and made ready, into which thus wrapped up they were borne. And so after the carpets were taken off them, they were neatly laid by each other, where with the curtains drawn before them they slept a good while. Now it was also time for the Virgin to see how our other artists behaved themselves. They were well pleased, because, as the Virgin afterwards informed me, they were to work in gold, which is indeed a piece of also this art, but not the most principal, most necessary and best. They had indeed to a part of these ashes, so that they imagined no other, but that the whole bird was provided for the sake of gold, and that life must thereby be restored to the deceased, during which we sat very still, attending when our married couple would awake. Thus about half an hour was spent, for then the wanton Cupid presented himself again, and after he had saluted us all, he flew to them behind the curtain, tormenting them so long till they awaked. This happened to them with very great amazement, for they imagined no other but they had hitherto slept from the very hour in which they were beheaded. Cupid, after he had awaked them, and renewed their acquaintance with one another, stepped aside a little, and permitted them both somewhat better to recruit themselves, meantime playing his tricks with us. And at length he would needs have the music fetched to be somewhat the merrier. Not long after, the Virgin herself comes, and after she had most humbly saluted the young king and queen, who found themselves somewhat faint, and kissed their hands, she brought them the 2 aforementioned curious garments, which they put on, and so stepped forth. Now they were already prepared 2 very curious chairs, wherein they placed themselves, and so were by us with the most profound reverence congratulated, for which the king in his own person most graciously returned his thanks, and again reassured us all of grace. It was already about 5 o'clock, wherefore they could make no longer stay, but as soon as ever the chiefest of their furniture could be laden, they were to attend the young royal persons down the winding stairs, through all doors and watches unto the ship, in which they embarked themselves, together with certain virgins and Cupid, and sailed so mighty swift that we soon lost sight of them. Yet they were met, as I was informed, by certain stately ships. Thus in 4 hours' time they had made many leagues out to sea. After 5 o'clock the musicians were charged to carry all things back again into the ships, and make themselves ready for the voyage. But because this was somewhat a long doing, the old lord commanded forth a party of his concealed soldiers, who had hitherto been planted in the wall, so that we had taken no notice of any of them, whereby I observed that this tower was well provided against opposition. Now these soldiers made quick work with our stuff, so that no more remained further to be done but go to supper. Now the table being completely furnished, the Virgin brings us again to our companions, where we were to carry ourselves as if we had truly been in a lamentable condition, and forbear laughing. But they were always smiling one upon another, howbeit some of them too sympathized with us. At this supper the old lord was with us too, who was a most sharp inspector over us, for none could propound anything so discreetly, but that he knew how either to confute it or amend it, or at least give to some good document upon it. I learned most by his lord, and it were very good that each one would apply himself to him, and take notice of his procedure, for then things would not so often and so untowardly miscarry. After we had taken our nocturnal defection, the old lord led us into his closets of rarities, which were here and there dispersed among the bulwarks, where we saw such wonderful productions of nature, and other things too which man's wit in imitation of nature had invented, that we needed a year or more sufficiently to survey them. Thus we spent a good part of the night by candlelight. At last, because we were more inclined to sleep than see many rarities, we were lodged in rooms in the wall, where we had not only costly good beds, but also besides extraordinary handsome chambers, which made us more wonder why we were the day before forced to undergo so many hardships. In this chamber I had a good rest, and being for the most part without care, and weary with continual labour, the gentle rushing of the sea helped me to a sound and sweet sleep, for I continued in wondering from 11 o'clock till 8 in the morning. The 7th day. After 8 o'clock I awaked, and quickly made myself ready, being desirous to return again into the tower. But the dark passages in the wall were so many and various that I wandered a good while before I could find the way out. The same happened to the rest too, till at last we all met again in the nearmost vault, and habits entirely yellow were given us, together with our golden fleeces. At this time the Virgin declared to us that we were knights of the golden stone, of which we were before ignorant. After we had now thus made ourselves ready, and taken our breakfast, the old man presented each of us with a medal of gold. On one side of these stood these words: "Art is the priestess of nature." On the other these: "Nature is the daughter of time," exhorting us moreover we should enterprise nothing beyond and against the token of remembrance. Herewith we went forth to the sea, where our ships lay so richly equipped, that it was not well possible but that such brave things must first have been brought thither. The ships were 12 in number, 6 of ours and 6 of the old lord's, who caused his ships to be freighted with well appointed soldiers. But he betook himself to us into our ship, where we all were together. In the first the musicians seated themselves, of which the old lord had also a great number. They sailed before us to shorten the time. Our flags were the 12 celestial signs, and we sat in Libra. Besides other things, our ship also had a noble and curious clock, which showed us all of the minutes. The sea too was so calm that it was a singular pleasure to sail. But that which surpassed all the rest was the old man's discourse, who so well knew how to pass away our time with wonderful histories, that I could have been content to sail with him my life long. Meantime the ships passed on amain, for before we had sailed 2 hours, the mariner told us that he already saw the whole lake almost covered with ships, by which we could conjecture they were come out to meet us. which also proved true. For as soon as we were gotten out of the sea into the lake by the aforementioned river, there presently stood into us 500 ships, one of which sparkled with mere gold and precious stones, in which sat the king and queen, together with other lords, ladies, and virgins of high birth. As soon as they were well in ken of us, the pieces were discharged on both sides, and there was such a din of trumpets, shawms, and kettle drums, that all the ships upon the sea capered again. Finally, as soon as we came near, they brought about our ships together, and so made us stand. Immediately the old Atlas stepped forth on the king's behalf, making a short but handsome oration, wherein he welcomed us, and demanded whether the royal parents were in readiness. The rest of my companions were in huge amazement, whence this king should arise, for they imagined no other but they must again awaken him. We suffered them to continue their wonderment, and carried ourselves as if it seemed strange to us too. After Atlas's oration, out steps our old man, making a somewhat larger reply, wherein he wished the king and queen all the happiness and increase, after which he delivered up a curious small casket, but what was in it I know not. It was only committed to Cupid, who hovered between them both, to keep. After the oration was finished, they again let off a joyful volley of shot, and so we sailed on a good time together, till at length we arrived at another shore. This was near the first gate, at which I first entered. At this place again there attended a great multitude of king's family, together with some hundreds of horses. Now as soon as we were come to shore, and disembarked, the king and queen presented their hands to all of us, one with another with singular kindness, and so we were to get upon horseback. Here I desire to have the reader friendly entreated not to interpret the following narration to any vain glory or pride of mine, but to credit me thus far, that if there had not been a special necessity in it, I could very well have utterly concealed this honour which was showed me. We were all one after another distributed amongst the lords, but our old lord, and I most unworthy, were to ride even with the king, each of us bearing a snow white ensign, with a red cross. I indeed was made use of because of my age, for we both had long grey beards and hair. I had besides fastened my token around about my hat, of which the young king soon took notice, and demanded, if I were he, who could at the gate redeem these tokens? I answered in most humble manner, yea. But he laughed on me, saying, there henceforth needed no ceremony. I was his father. Then he asked me, wherewith had I redeemed them? I replied, with water and salt. Whereupon he wondered who had made me so wise. Upon which I grew somewhat more confident, and recounted unto him how it had happened to me with my bread, the dove, and the raven. And he was pleased with it, and said expressly, that it must needs be, that God had herein vouchsafed me for a singular happiness. Herewith we came to the first gate, where the porter with blue clothes waited, who bare in his hand a supplication. Now as soon as he spied me even with the king, he delivered me the supplication, most humbly beseeching me to mention his ingenuity towards me before the king. Now in the first place I demanded of the king what the condition of this porter was, who friendly answered me, that he was a very famous and rare astrologer, and always in high regard with the lord his father, but having on a time committed a fault against Venus, and beheld her in her bed of rest, this punishment was therefore imposed upon him, that he should so long wait at the first gate till someone should release him from thence. I replied, may he then be released? Yes, said the king. If any one can be found that hath as highly transgressed himself, he must stand in his stead, and the other shall be free. This word went to my heart, for my conscience convinced me that I was the offender, yet I held my peace, and herewith delivered the supplication. As soon as he had read it, he was mightily terrified, so that the queen, who, with our virgins and that other queen besides of whom I mention at the hanging of the weights, read just behind us, observed it, and therefore asked him what this letter might signify. But he had no mind that he should take notice of it, but putting up the paper, began to discourse of other matters, till thus in about 3 hours we came to quite the castle, where we alighted, and waited upon the king into his forementioned hall. Immediately the king called for the old Atlas to come to him in a little closet, and showed him the writing, who made no long tarrying, but read out again to the porter to take better cognizance of the matter. After which the young king with his spouse and other lords, ladies, and virgins sat down. Then began our virgin highly to commend the diligence we had used, and the pains and labour we had undergone, requesting we might be royally rewarded, and that she henceforth might be permitted to enjoy the benefit of her commission. Then the old lord stood up too, and attested that all that the Virgin had spoken was true, and that if it was but equity that we should both on both parts be contented. Hereupon we were to step out a little, and it was concluded that each man should make some possible wish, and accordingly obtain it. For it was not to be doubted but that those of understanding would also make the best wish. So we were to consider of it till after supper. Meantime, the king and queen, for recreation's sake, began to fall to play together. It looked not unlike chess, only it had other laws, for it was the Venus and the vices one against the other, where it might ingeniously be observed with what plots and vices lay in wait for the virtues, and how to recounter them again. This was so properly and artificially performed that it were to be wished that we had the game too. During the game in comes Atlas again, and makes his report in private, yet I blushed all over, for my conscience gave me no rest. After which the king presented me the supplication to read, and contents whereof were much to this purpose, for he wished the king prosperity and increase, that his seed might be spread abroad far and wide. Afterwards he remonstrated that the time was now accomplished, wherein, according to the royal promise, he ought to be released, because Venus was already uncovered by one of his guests, and his observations could not lie to him, and that if his majesty would please to make a strict and diligent inquiry, he would find that she had been uncovered, and in case this should not prove to be so, he would be content to remain before the gate all of his days. Then he sued in the most humble manner, that upon the peril of body and life he might be permitted to be present at this night's supper. He was in good hopes to spy out the very offender and obtain his wished freedom. This was expressly and handsomely indicated, by which I well perceived his ingenuity, but it was too sharp for me, and I could well have endured never to have seen it. Now I was casting in my mind whether he might perchance be helped through my wish, so I asked the king whether he might not be released some other way. "No," replied the king, "because there is a special consideration in the business. However, for this night we may well gratify him in his desire." And so he sent one forth to fetch him in. Meantime the tables were prepared in a spacious room, in which we had never been before. It was so complete, and in such manner contrived, that it is not possible for me only to begin to describe it. Into this we were conducted with singular pomp and ceremony. Cupid was not present at this time, for, as I was informed, the disgrace which had happened to his mother had somewhat angered him. In brief, my offence, and the supplication which was delivered, were an occasion of much sadness, for the king was in perplexity how to make inquisition amongst his guests, and the more because thus even they too, who were ignorant of the matter, would come to the knowledge of it. So he caused the porter himself, who was already come, to make his strict survey, and showed himself as pleasant as he was able. Howbeit at length they began again to be merry, and to bespeak one another with all sorts of recreative and profitable discourses. Now how the treatment and other ceremonies were then performed, it is not necessary to declare, since it is neither the reader's concern nor serviceable to my design. But all exceeded more in art and human invention than that we were overcharged with drinking. And this was the last and noblest meal at which I was present. After the banquet, the tables were suddenly taken away, and curious chairs placed round about in a circle, in which we together with the king and queen, both their old men, the ladies and virgins, were to sit. After which a very handsome page opened the above mentioned glorious little book, when Atlas, immediately placing himself in the midst, began to bespeak us to the ensuing purpose: that his royal majesty had not yet committed to oblivion the service we had done him, and how carefully we had attended our duty, and therefore, by way of retribution, had elected all and each of the knights of the golden stone. That it was therefore further necessary not only once again to oblige ourselves towards his royal majesty, but to vow too upon the following articles, and then his royal majesty would likewise know how to behave himself toward his liege people. Upon which he caused the page to read over the articles, which were these: You, my lords the knights, shall swear that you shall at no time ascribe your order either unto any devil or spirit, but only to God your Creator and his handmaid Nature; that you will abominate all whoredom, inconsistency, and uncleanliness, and not defile your order with such vices; that through your talents will be ready to assist all that are worthy and have need of them; that you desire not to employ this honour to worldly pride and high authority; that you shall not be willing to live longer than God will have you. At this last article we could not choose but laugh sufficiently, and it may well have been placed after the rest only for a conceit. Now being to vow to them all by the king's sceptre, we were afterwards with the usual ceremonies installed knights, and amongst other privileges set over ignorance, poverty, and sickness, to handle them at our pleasure. And this was afterwards ratified in a little chapel, whither we were all conducted in a procession, and thanks returned to God for it, where I also at that time to the honour of God hung up my golden fleece and hat, and left them there for an eternal memorial. And because every one was there to write his name, I writ thus: The highest knowledge is to know nothing. Brother Christian Rosenkreutz, Knight of the Golden Stone, in the year 1459. Others writ otherwise, and truly each as seemed him good. After which we were again brought into the hall, where being sat down, we were admonished quickly to bethink ourselves what every one would wish. But the king and his party retired into a little closet, there to give audience to our wishes. Now each man was called in severally, so that I cannot speak of any man's proper wish. I thought nothing could be more praiseworthy than in honour of my order to demonstrate some laudable virtue, and found too that none at present voted to be more famous, and cost me more trouble than gratitude. Wherefore, not regarding that I might well have wished somewhat more dear and agreeable to myself, I vanquished myself, and concluded, even with my own peril, to free the porter my benefactor. Wherefore, being called in, I was first of all demanded, whether, having read the supplication, I had observed or suspected nothing concerning the offender? Upon which I began undauntedly to relate how all the business had passed, how through ignorance I fell into that mistake, and so offered myself to undergo all that I had thereby demerited. The king and the rest of the lords wondered mightily at so unhoped for confession, and so wished me to step aside a little. Now, as soon as I was called for again, Atlas declared to me, that although it were grievous to the king's majesty, that I whom he loved above others was fallen into such a mischance, yet because it was not possible for him to transgress his ancient usages, he knew not how else to absolve me, but that the other must be at liberty, and I placed in his stead. Yet he would hope that some other would soon be apprehended, so that I might be able to go home again. However, no release was to be hoped for, till the marriage feast of his future son. This sentence had near cost me my life, and I first hated myself for my twaddling tongue, in that I could not hold my peace. Yet at last I took courage, and because I considered there was no remedy, I related how this porter had bestowed a token on me, and commended me to the other, by whose assistance I stood upon the scale, and so was made partaker of all the honour and joy already received, and therefore now it was but equal that I showed myself gratefully to my benefactor. And because the same could no way else be done, I returned thanks for the sentence, and was willing gladly to sustain some inconvenience for his sake, who had been helpful to me in coming so high a place. But if by my wish anything might be effected, I wished myself at home again, and that so he by me, and I by my wish might be at liberty. Answer was made me, that the wishing stretched not so far. However I might well wish him free, yet it was very pleasing to his royal majesty that I had behaved myself so generously herein. But he was afraid that I might still be ignorant into what a miserable condition I had plunged myself through this my curiosity. Hereupon the good man was pronounced free, and I, with a sad heart, was fain to step aside. After me the rest were called for too, who came jocundly out again, which was still more to my smart, for I imagined no other, but that I must finish my life under the gate. I had so many pensive thoughts running up and down my head, what I should yet undertake, and wherewith to spend the time. At length I considered that I was now old, and, according to the course of nature, had few years more to live, and that this anguish and melancholy life would easily dispatch me, and then my doorkeeping would be at an end, and that, by a most happy sleep, I might quickly bring myself into the grave. I had a sundry of these thoughts. Sometimes it vexed me that I had seen such gallant things, and must be robbed of them. Sometimes it rejoiced me that yet before my end I had been accepted to all joy, and should not be forced to so shamefully depart. This was the last and worst shock that I sustained. During these my cogitations the rest were ready. Wherefore, after they had received a good night from the kings and lords, each one was conducted into his lodging. But I, most wretched man, had no body to show me the way, and yet must moreover suffer myself to be tormented, that I might be certain of my future function. I was fain to put on the ring, which the other had before worn. Finally, the king exhorted me, that since this was now the last time I was like to see him in this manner, I should however behave myself according to my place, and not against the order. Upon which he took me also in his arms, and kissed me. All of which I so understood, as if in the morning I must sit at my gate. Now after they had all a while spoken friendly to me, and at last presented their hands, committing me to divine protection, I was by both the old men, the lord of the tower, and Atlas conducted into a glorious lodging, in which stood 3 beds, and each of us lay in one of them, where we spent almost 2 and see. Here are wanting about 2 leaves in quarto, and he, the author hereof, whereas he imagined he must in the morning be doorkeeper, returned home. End of the 6th and 7th day. Recording by Kirk Ziegler, Ogden, Utah. Voiceovers by Kirk.com. End of the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, author unknown. Translated by E. Foxcroft.